I wanted to look at that, but I began to look at it because, again, I was searching for that quid pro quo. How does Israel get away with it? And what I began to see was that Israel, in fact, supplies weapons and security systems and tactics and models of control to elites, governments or elites all over the world, including corporations that are concerned about, controlling their populations and what we call security. So it turns out that Israel is very strong, and what's interesting here, this is what I call security politics. International politics where you factor in the military, where you factor in this $2.5 trillion industry. And a whole different set of foreign relations begins to emerge, because arms and power and control bypass ideologies. This is where you don't have friends, you have interests. So Israel, as we know, is very close to the global north. This is certainly a key form of support that Israel gets. It's a strategic ally of the United States. By treaty, formally, the United States is obliged to intervene on behalf of Israel if it faces any existential threat from anywhere. By treaty, that's not a choice. In addition, the Congress for the last 30 years or so has a policy of guaranteeing Israel what is called a qualitative military edge over all its neighbors in the Middle East combined. It's called QME. And in other words, the United States is engaged in its own internal arms race against itself. Because if you sell, like you did last year, $7 billion in cutting-edge weapons to Saudi Arabia,
Unbelievable.
Inside the Department of Defense.
Probably not.
Construction began, ironically, on September 11, 1941.
What are they doing at DOD?
Smoke weed every day. Smoke weed every day.
which is not exactly a paragon of human rights. You have to guarantee that Israel doesn't lose its qualitative military edge over Arab countries that get these arms. So you have to increase, either qualitatively or quantitatively, the amount of arms that Israel gets. So, for example, selling these arms to Saudi Arabia, Israel was granted a whole squadron of F-35s, these cutting edge, and Israel is going to get these planes before the American Air Force does. And they cover two they kill two birds with one stone. On the one hand, they help guarantee Israel this qualitative military edge because they're getting a kind of cutting-edge weaponry that the Arab states won't get, no matter how much money they pay. And on the other hand, Israel tests them. I mean, why is Israel getting them before the American Air Force? It would be much better to have Israeli pilots test F-35s in the region in different ways than to have American pilots test them in Texas somewhere. That's maybe less so today with some of the conflicts, but the United States is very reluctant to deploy the F-35s. They're not right deployable now, so they use Israel as a kind of a test case. So Israel has then from the United States this qualitative military edge guaranteed, which means last week President Obama signed a bill giving Israel $40 billion in new arms. Just Israel. $40 billion in new arms over a 10-year period between 2018 and 2028. That increases by $10 billion the $30 billion in arms that Bush granted Israel in the decade before. So in the 20 years, between 2008 and 2028, this little country, the size of New Jersey, in the most volatile area of the world, is getting $70 billion of American weaponry. Now you imagine what Washington, the state of Washington, could do with $70 billion? It could fix a few bridges. So that it's and in addition to that, Israel has privileged access to American military technologies. Intel, for example, which is really a military company, has research and development hubs in the Silicon Valley, Ireland, and Israel. And so Israel is engaged in all kinds of joint projects with the United States. For example, Israel can't produce an F-35. It's way too big. It's a small country. It could never afford to build it. But Israel does what it calls niche filling. In order to make itself indispensable, it supplies high-tech components to weapon systems in a way that you can't have these systems without some Israeli input. So a lot of the cockpit of the F-35 is in fact Israeli, meaning the avionics, the electronic, all the electronics of not all, but a lot of the electronics of the plane, the radar, the targeting, and of course these are technologies that Israel is then able to bring back to use on the Palestinians and to develop on the Palestinians. Israel is also very close to Europe, of course. There's all kinds of projects, including the Watchkeeper, which is the new European drone that's being developed, which is an Israeli drone. Israel is also a part of NATO. It's not a member of NATO, but it's in what's called the NATO neighborhood, which means it does joint exercises with NATO, and its weapons are interoperational with those of NATO. But again, security politics bypasses ideologies. So here we have a situation where Israel seems dependent on the United States. You know, we're America's most loyal ally. We love America. We share common values. Netanyahu's invited to speak before Congress every 3 weeks. You know, and imagine Israel's special influence in this country. Here you had, a few months ago, Netanyahu, a foreign head of state, invited by the Republican Party into the American Congress, where he was welcomed by both parties. A joint session, almost the entire House and Senate together, sitting. A foreign head of state addresses Congress to oppose a policy of your own president. And his own party supports the foreign head of state over your own president. And not only that, in the 20-minute speech of Netanyahu to the American Congress, he got a standing ovation 42 times. The Israeli press were laughing. The Israeli press said the American Congress looked like the North Korean parliament. Up and down and up and down and up and down, both parties. So Israel really has this kind of input into the United States, but also into other parts of the global north. But it doesn't end there. There's a whole group of countries that are challenging the hegemony, the domination of Europe and the United States. And they're called, you know this term, the BRICS countries. The BRICS are Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. These are countries that have very powerful emerging economies. I mean, China today, I think, has the world's largest economy, or second largest, that are challenging, again, the Euro-American domination. And you can add to them another block of countries that are sort of joining him, called the Mint countries, which is Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. And these countries know that they're a bloc. They have summit meetings every couple of years. And there's all kinds of plans. So this isn't just some conceptual thing. These are the arch rivals, to some degree, of the United States, led, of course, by China. I mean, the United States is moving the entire Sixth Fleet into the South Pacific. They're very concerned about China, militarily, politically in the region. Economically, of course, China kind of owns the American economy. And then you begin to look at the map from an arms point of view, and look, the second largest arms supplier to China is Israel. Your ally, your friend, the only democracy in the Middle East, is the number 2 arms supplier to your arch rival, China, after Russia.
And I'll not refrain either from pointing out possibly more insidious factors that demonstrate to me rather conclusively that Israel is an untenable ally, or that when Israel, you've got Israeli arms merchants often selling arms to our most likely enemies, UAVs to Russia here lately, when UAVs were a problem for Russia. They're no longer a problem.
Now there's a Cold War kind of beginning again with Russia and Putin and so on. So here's Russia, followed by Israel, supplying the Chinese military that the United States is very concerned about. And then you look, India. Israel is the second, third, fourth, it depends what year, largest arms supplier to India after Russia. So here's little Israel that's supplying 2 of the largest militaries in the world. Not to mention, I won't get into it all, Nigeria. In every single BRICS Mint country, Israel is present and very strong. But not only there, Israel is also present in almost the entire global south, the developing countries, what we call the third world sometimes. I would argue that Israel has more global reach in terms of military security policing than the United States does. People say, well, that's crazy.